This week, Holy Blossom Temple will house a voting station. This happens often, routinely, and we barely even notice, except for those like Russ Joseph, Executive Director, who need to look after making sure everything is in order. But really, it is astonishing that a synagogue could so matter-of-factly be a voting station in this city, and that people of all kinds, of every stripe, would come and go freely without a second thought to come and cast their ballot here. It's an honor and it's a privilege, and we should call attention to it. I learned that in the colonies, which would later become Canada, the vote was a privilege reserved for only a fraction of the population. Mainly affluent men would be eligible because the right to vote was attached to property rights and assets of specified value. Had to do with the taxes that you paid or the rent that you paid. Over time, the right to vote was extended gradually and not consistently. Sometimes the right would be offered and then retrieved over time. And I learned something too about voting stations in Canada. In the early years, they were such passionate places that they were actually considered too dangerous for women. Here's a description of a Montreal polling station in 1820. Oh, and I also learned that candidates would give out free alcohol. So that led to the fiery passions for politics. Here's what's written. Passions ran so high that a terrible fight broke out. Punches and every other offensive and defensive tactic were employed. In the blink of an eye, table legs were turned into swords and the rest into shields. The combatants unceremoniously went for each other's nose, hair, and other handy parts, pulling at them mercilessly. The faces of many and the bodies of nearly all attested to the doggedness of the fighting. Such passion for the vote. Now, of course, the Jewish people have our own story of how citizenship came to be here, how the vote came to be here. 1831 and 1832 were pivotal years, including the leadership of Ezekiel Hart, the first Jew to be elected to public office in the entire British Empire. He sealed it, sealed citizenship and full rights, including the right to vote. We have here at the front of the sanctuary a stained glass window which in part is devoted to the Jewish narrative of immigration to this story, to this country. Each one of us, early or late, is somehow an immigrant to these shores. So imagine those first Jewish voters. Imagine how acutely aware they were that they were now participants in the system of rule rather than victims of it. Imagine the thrill of casting that ballot. We have memoirs from Jews who lived in the 1880s on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. They talk about how they arrived to these shores by way of steerage, how they labored in sweatshops, but come election day, they were first class. They described going into the election booths wearing suit and tie, as though they were going to synagogue on Yom Tov. They saw this newfound political freedom as a blessing from God, as though they were fulfilling a sacred obligation, a mitzvah. It is a sad truth that today so many people who are eligible to vote in this good country forfeit it without a second thought and choose, for one reason or another, not to exercise their right to vote. I've noticed in recent years, and you may have seen this trend too, that it does seem that our Jewish young people are more engaged in political discourse than they had even 10 years ago. And I think this is a good sign of renewed interest in civic responsibility. Our Torah portion tells of the dangers that can come with humanity as we were created. The end of last week's Torah portion doesn't end with the glory of the Garden of Eden. It ends with these words: "When the eternal God saw how great was the wickedness of human beings on earth, and the direction of their thoughts to be nothing but wicked all the time, the eternal God regretted having made human beings on earth at all, and God was heartsick. So the Eternal One thought to God's self, I will wipe the human beings whom I created off the face of the earth, the humans, and with them the beasts, the reptiles, the birds of the sky, for I rue the day that I made them. V'Noach matza chen be'enei Adonai. But Noah found favor in God's sight." It's a bit of a cliffhanger that leads us very swiftly to this week's Torah portion. And we heard the words. We heard again of God's frustration, even anger, intolerance with the wickedness and the violence that filled the earth. It is written, "The earth became violent before God, no longer just wicked thoughts, but now wicked action. The earth became filled with Hamas," is the Hebrew word, which repeats itself again and again, violence. When God saw how violent was the earth, how all flesh was acting with Hamas, with violence upon the earth, God said to Noah, "The end of all flesh has come to mind before me. Because the earth is full of Hamas, because the earth is full of violence on their account, now look, I am going to wipe all of humanity off the face of the earth. Noah, make yourself an ark." Now I should clarify that the Arabic word Hamas does not mean violence, as the Hebrew word does. I'm told it means enthusiasm or fervor, and that it is for the political party and the movement of Hamas. It stands for 3 words, Islamic Resistance Movement. But on Hebrew ears, this is the word that repeats itself again and again in our Torah portion. And God says, "Wash the earth clean of this violence. I cannot tolerate it." And after the flood, and after the rainbow, God says there needs to be the rule of law. These people cannot only be trusted with their instincts, with their God-given impulse both for good and evil, but rather now I will bless them with the gift of law. Our sages, by way of interpretation, teach us that God established then and there a minimum of 7 laws, the Noahide laws, which would rule for all peoples. The Jewish people would be further disciplined by 613, but all humanity could create a civilization if they embrace just these 7. 1, do not worship idols. 2, do not blaspheme God's name. 3, establish courts of justice. 4, do not murder. 5, do not commit adultery. 6, do not steal. And 7 might surprise you, do not cut the flesh of a living animal. According to our sages, these are the basic minimum, both religious and legal precepts that provide society to function and allow civilization to advance. Now, you may have noticed that even among these 7, there is a melding of what we might call religious and civil. because for the biblical author, it's all one whole. And I would say for most religionists, until very recently, it was all one whole. Today, part of what we hear so often is that we must have a very clear distinction between anything that sounds like religion and anything that sounds like civic responsibility. Not so in the Jewish world, not so for most who embrace the wisdom of the Hebrew Bible. You may have read that before the High Holy Days, there was a lot of exchange about whether or not rabbis should speak about politics, about Israel in particular, that we should leave politics to the politicians and to the pundits. But Judaism takes a maximalist view on life. Torah itself is all-encompassing. Laws on agriculture and family life are woven together with the rights of a landed immigrant and the rights of the asylum seeker. Torah includes criminal law and property law, economic justice, health care, and yes, even about modes of transportation. It's all there. Nothing is off limits. There's no separation of church and state. It's all mitzvah. Every aspect of life is addressed. Every situation and scenario is seen through the lens of how we might increase sanctity, how we might see God's hand more and more in this world, how we might show ourselves to be in service to God and humanity with all heart, with all mind, with all soul, and how we might become God's partners in the unfolding of this beautiful and sometimes terrifying creation. It seems the word religion itself, needs broadening. I'm afraid it has been reduced and pinched more and more to refer only to very specific religious practices and beliefs. All too often, sectarian doctrines and sectarian agendas are pursued in the name of religion, thereby giving religion a bad name. But taking the broad view of a religious environment allows us to stand on common ground. The common ground that there is some moral divine law that claims us. We can call it matters of conscience that claim us, a core morality that demands something of us so that we might maintain this social fabric, as delicate as it is. And I believe that the word politics also must be broadened. I'm afraid this word, too, has been reduced and pinched to specific personalities and specific pursuits. The very word politics, as it's used in everyday language today, is a synonym for power grab. It's a synonym for empty slogans. We say, oh, that's just politics. He's just playing politics. How did that come to be? Too often, these are pursued. These corruptions are pursued in the name of politics and give the whole endeavor also a bad name. But taking a broad view, politics is the arena for debate and discourse, the creative forum for public policy to be shaped and applied so that we can have impact and uplift on the society in which we live. I believe that broad religion and broad politics make good partners. Narrow politics and narrow religions make the worst partners. This week, of course, we mourn for Corporal Nathan Carrillo and Warrant Officer Patrice Vincent. We have been shaken this week. And the question of the day is, are we changed by it? Is this something new? Does this demand of us something new? That is the question of the hour, and I'm sure among us there is a range of opinion. I read an opinion piece in this week's Globe and Mail, you may have seen it too, that when the New York Times columnist Roger Cohen tweeted, "When Canada goes, it's all over." And then there was a quick backlash from good Canadians everywhere, a Canadian backlash on Twitter, a backlash against exaggeration, against hysteria and despair, a backlash against overreaction and in favor of calming down. Canada isn't going anywhere, says the author. Nothing about what makes us us is over. He continues, in light of this week, Canada may have to change, but whatever changes we choose to make should be done carefully and calmly, with an understanding of the limited scale of the threat and the nature of the trade-offs between freedom and safety. Any changes made, from security at public buildings to a long-standing system of laws that criminalize action but not thought, should be done only for the benefit of millions of law-abiding Canadians, and not as a panicky reaction to a very small number of men who, unlike some dangers that Canada has faced before, pose no threat whatsoever to the survival of Canada. They are murderers, but their delusions are shared by few, he says. They are not an existential threat to the Canada we cherish. They cannot destroy our society. So let us take the true measure of the danger and respond appropriately. If this week's events have shaken us, and if we want to say that Canadian values remain strong and true, then we need to be able to articulate what are those Canadian values. And in this setting, I would also ask if we say that Jewish values remain the same as ever, passed down from one generation to the next. I look at our terrific Bonot mitzvah here. Then we need to be able to articulate what are those Jewish values. How are these the same, and how might they need to change? Let us say, if this is the government that I choose or don't choose, then I know what it is that I want otherwise. If we say this is the religion that I choose or don't choose, this is the religious expression, this is the God that I choose or don't choose, let us be able to articulate what it is that we are after. And if we despise what people have done in the name of God and religion, then we have to be able to correct it and say, this is what happens in the name of God and religion. And this is what happens in the name of our societal pursuits. I'll share that personally, it has been a week for me too, reflecting on these themes. And so I've taken the first concrete step to apply for Canadian citizenship. For many years here as a landed immigrant, I've enjoyed a voice, and I've enjoyed getting to know Canadian values and coming to admire them, to understand how they are distinct from my beloved home country, south of the border, as you say. But now it does feel even more important to be able to cast a vote. Let me conclude with a prayer written by Rabbi Naomi Levy of Los Angeles, and I'll share something of her personal history too. Her own father was murdered not by a hate crime, but caught in the crossfire, in the wrong place at the wrong time, as we say. And this is her prayer for a better world. And you can hear echoes of this week's Torah portion in what she writes. You have given us a wonderful and horrible world, God. Why? Why is this world so beautiful and majestic, and yet so full of disaster and disease? Why is there abundance and dire poverty, kindness and cruelty? Why do some live in peace while others live in fear and war, victims of violence? Why did you bless us on the one hand, God, and curse us with the other? Please show yourself, God. Help us. Give us the wisdom to eradicate disease and violence. Give us the tools to end hunger and poverty. Give us the courage and compassion to overcome hatred and bloodshed. Turn our complacency into action. Soften our hardened hearts and transform our despair into hope. Amen.